Good morning, good afternoon, or evening to everyone joining us from across the globe. Wherever you may be, we appreciate your presence. I'm Meenakshi Bhagat, representing Indian Institute of Urban Designers and Urban Design Group London. We have a member from Urban Design Group, Robert Huxford, our speaker Vinita Dhume, and few members from both the groups. Today marks the first event in the collaboration between Indian Institute of Urban Designers, New Delhi chapter, and Urban Design Group London, initiated with the aim of forming an integrated ecosystem for knowledge sharing through the members of both organizations. Through this collective effort, we aim to bring forth fascinating subject, meaningful conversations, and create opportunities to learn from one another. In the 21st century, we are designing smarter cities than ever before, equipped with real-time data, digital twins, green tech, and predictive systems, and with whatnot. Yet at the same time, many cities around the world are struggling with deeply fundamental issues, inefficient transport networks, water mismanagement, and ecological stress, to name a few. We often call those as modern complications. But the truth is, the core challenges of urban life, how to structure, serve, and sustain human settlements, have existed for millennia. That brings us to an important question. Are there lessons embedded in ancient cities that remain relevant today as practical intelligence? Today's talk, a glimpse into the world of Indus Valley civilizations. One of the most compelling examples of historical urbanism is the Indus Valley Civilization. Dating back over 4,500 years, the Indus Valley was one of the largest and most systematically organized civilizations of the Bronze Age. If you look at the world map of present day, it was from northwest India to eastern Pakistan, which hosted hundreds of settlements, many of which can be described as urban in form and function. And here's what stands out. Across this massive geographical spread, we see surprising standardization and order. From an urban planning perspective, that raises a fascinating insight. How did such widespread spatial coherence emerge in the absence of visible top down power structures? What kind of knowledge systems, design logic, or cultural agreements allowed these cities to function with such clarity? It forces us to revisit what we define as progress, because here was a civilization that managed environmental integrations, resource efficiency, and civic order without monumental domination. And it makes us to reconsider a core idea that urban intelligence is not always dependent on technology. It can also stem from systems thinking, collective standards, and deep contextual awareness. Despite its impressive infrastructure and long period of prosperity, those cities declined, and eventually abandonment remained a subject of debate. And perhaps that's the value in this conversation. Today, we'll touch upon not to glorify the past, but to reframe it as a reference point, a place where planning was not reactive and rigid, but proactive and structured, where cities were not designed around spectacle, but around systems. The talk the talk is structured to include a question and answer session after the presentation, along with an open discussion. Please feel free to share your questions or thoughts in the chat box during the session. If you would prefer to contribute verbally or discuss a point in context, you're welcome to raise your hand. We'll open the floor for discussion and question and answer right after the presentation. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Vinita Dhume, who will speak not about just an ancient civilization, but about urbanism and city planning as an evolving continuum with underlying layers. Vinita is director in urban design and architecture. Her work includes both the public and private sector projects. She has more than 25 years of experience in master planning and architecture and brings an abundance of knowledge on urban regeneration. She has contributed to Greenbelt research and analysis in partnership with London School of Economics. She's a member of many design review panels in London and wider Southeast. Chair of Tower Hamlet Quality Review Panel, and co-chair of Westminster Design Review Panel. Thank you, Vinita, for joining us today. Please take us through this fascinating subject through your perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Meenakshi, for that lovely introduction to Indus Valley and also for introducing me. I'm really excited to talk about the Indus Valley Civilization. And as you've kind of set the scene quite helpfully, this was one of the major ancient civilizations in a part of Asia, which covered part of Pakistan and India. And it had really strong relationships with some of its contemporaries, which is Mesopotamia and Egypt at the time. But actually, very little has been uncovered about these people. And although we've done a lot of archaeological surveys, their language has not been deciphered. We've not been able to understand some of the code languaging. So a lot of it still stays as a mystery, but there is a lot we can still learn from what has been uncovered so far through archaeological surveys. Now, the one thing I do want to tell you is I'm not a historian, but as an urban designer and a city planner, over time, I've done a lot of research, and this was a topic that was taught to me in school. So, as part of humanities, I was exposed to what the Indus Valley Civilization gave us and how some of those traditions have actually fallen through and even come through to present day times where we practice them in India and also Pakistan, also Afghanistan. And eventually, my studies kind of led to when I did architecture, I started to gaze a bit more into what Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, who were the two major urban cities, and what they really gave us in terms of learnings. So I'd like to share a bit of that knowledge with you. So let's dive into this. So, what are some of the facts? So, like I said, a lot has been written about Mesopotamia. We know a lot about ancient Egypt. And also, fortunately, we've had lots of huge monuments, lots of structures that we've actually studied through Mesopotamia and Egypt. Now, bear in mind, these were cities and this was a region that was contemporaneous with Mesopotamia and Egypt. But, like I said, not a lot has been learned or uncovered about Indus Valley, which we will learn a bit today because archaeologists at separate times or several times through the years from 1856 almost up to 1950 have done a lot of archaeological surveys to try and understand what was the life in Indus Valley and particularly Mohenjo-daro at the time. So like Meenakshi said, more than 4,500 years ago, it's one of the earliest grid city planning systems. So when you see some of the grid cities today, one has to ask the question, where did that grid city pattern or the concept really evolve? And Mohenjo-daro, particularly Harappa, particularly some of the big urban cities within Indus Valley, have time and again shown us that grid cities really work. Many a times we think they might be boring setups, but actually they're not. There's a lot they give in terms of order, but there's a lot that you can also create in terms of adaptability within grid systems, which is what we will start to see that has been uncovered. Egalitarian society. Why would you say they're an egalitarian society? So, like I said, in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, we've got the pyramids, we've got the huge structures that we've studied. There was no trace, I would say, of there being a ruling class. So it was quite equitable in terms of how the houses were built, how the different districts of houses were built. So clearly there was a class system, I would say, because they have found bigger homes, they found smaller homes, but generally they found a standardized construction pattern. They found a standardized approach to how sanitation, how drainage, how water supply, and all of these elements were looked at within the society. And there might have been a wider administration system, but generally, they feel it was a very equitable society and everybody lived in harmony around nature. So there was a lot of integration with nature, including animals and how they worked with the hinterlands. So all of these cities clearly depended on the Indus Valley, but there was a very strong relationship with nature and there were standardized systems within each of the cities. So, for example, when you look at Harappa, when you look at Mohenjo-daro, what's very interesting is there's a standard set method in terms of how some of those grid cities were designed. What were the major roads like? What were the minor roads like? There is a pattern there's an administrative kind of pattern to how some of these cities were evolved within that system. And like I say, it's the advanced bronze age metallurgy. I'll tell you why. Because if you compare, in at the same time we had kind of, the Stonehenge, or just before that, the Stonehenge happening in England, whereas these guys had really understood metallurgy. I think apart from iron, they had discovered quite a few metals, and they were really good at creating tools out of them, jewelry out of them, and also using them within their architectural structures. So a lot of the kind of brickwork also had timber frames, but they also use metal very, very intelligently in terms of construction patterns. So that just goes to show they were way ahead of their times, and a very sophisticated system in terms of how they built their cities and patterns. So now let's look at the kind of geography of how this was really spread out. Like I said, it had wider trade routes and relationships as well with Mesopotamia at the time, and also Egypt. And one finds that quite difficult to imagine. But on land, they would use bullocks and they had carts. And then they also had developed a whole maritime industry where they would have boats that would take products all the way to Mesopotamia. So some seals have been found in Egypt and Mesopotamia in later years, and those are Harappan seals because this is known as the Harappan civilization. And there are about 600 odd seals that have been actually found, and people are still trying to understand what those seals mean. But there's some kind of an administrative element attached to that, where a product was sent over to Mesopotamia. There was a seal, there was a stamp that actually said this is from Maluha or this is from the Indus Valley area. So they had a very strong relationship, and they had very strong trade ties at the time with Mesopotamia and also Egypt. Now, when you see the geographical patterns, there were more than about 1,000 settlements in this area. And you can see that a lot of the yellow dots that you see, they've now been geographically located on Google Earth. A lot of the settlements were based around the Indus Valley and the river. So, like I said, the relationship with nature was very strong. Cities were built in particular locations, and they were built on higher mounds because this is a very fertile floodplain. So even at that time, they were very ingenious in terms of how they built infrastructure first. They built the cities on top. And Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Harappa, Lothal are some of the major centers. They're really known as the urban centers of the time. So there were centers of different sizes. And you can start seeing the trade routes over here. And I apologize, some of the images are a bit blurry because I've been able to get them off the internet. I've given sources in references later, but I've not been able to get you very good images of high resolution. So bear with me, some images might be blurry. But what this is starting to show is that trade that used to happen over land and also through sea. So just imagine how smart they were at the time where the trade ties were established. They had figured out routes on land through Afghanistan and areas to get to, which is present day Iran, Iraq, where the war is going on at the moment, also southern part of Turkey and a part of Syria, which is where Mesopotamia and Egypt, as we know, is very dependent on the Nile. And in terms of the population, just to give you an idea, the spread of this area was about 3 million square meters, so just kilometers. So you can just imagine the geographic area. And to talk about Indus Valley, a lot of the ice that actually melts from the Himalayas and the ranges does come down. And this used to be known as the river Saraswati, one of the major rivers where the cities were actually located and some of the bigger centers were located, is known as the Saraswati. And a lot of the people eventually moved. And that's why we've got the term called Saraswat Brahmins, who've moved all across India today. And there are different sects of Saraswat Brahmins. They consider themselves coming from the Saraswati River. So there's also heritage aspects which we build up in terms of, although these guys were obliterated, a lot of the people left those cities eventually after the decline. And during the time, I think some of the biggest cities had populations of 40,000 to 60,000. So you can just imagine they were quite dense conglomerations, urban centers. So what actually caused the decline of the Indus Valley civilization? There are several theories that you will read, and when you do the research, you'll realize that a lot of people say that Aryans actually came in and they started to take over some of these major cities. But then that theory was actually passed by other historians who said, actually, the river changed the course. And that seems to be the real issue, because what landed up happening is due to climate change issues. There was a lot of flooding in the region, and this area was prone to a lot of flooding, famines, droughts. And that's why when you see the cities, there are layers and layers of cities built one on top of the other. And that's why the grid system really helped them, because they knew from a grid pattern it was very easy to replicate as floods happened. Already the cities were on mounds, but there was a massive big event that did happen. There were tectonic events that did happen. And River Saraswati eventually, you can see from some of the research that it changed course. So that could be one of the reasons why eventually people, it didn't happen overnight, but people started to slowly leave these cities and started to settle in other parts of the region, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also different parts of India. So you can see that the population spread and left the Indus Valley. And clearly you can see in its more mature phase, like I said, there were more than 1,000 settlements of different sizes. You can see those red dots, the white ones are the major cities. And then over time, by 1900, there was a major decline, and you could start seeing that the cities had started to be abandoned. Like I said, the major ones were Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Lokhal, and Rakhigari. Some of them are in northwestern part of India. Many of them are in Pakistan. As you know, Mohenjo-daro is in Pakistan, and they've got a museum which is dedicated to studies related to Mohenjo-daro. So let's zoom a bit into Mohenjo-daro. This is the interesting part. Now we've looked at the wider setting of Indus Valley. And why I have set it up in three segments really is it's really good to understand how infrastructure first approach was actually the basis of their city planning. Then we can look at the urban planning. And then we can look at a bit of the economy, the religion, the culture, what really the people of the Indus Valley overall did for occupation in terms of jobs and how they work with nature. So I've just set this up in kind of three segments really, and we'll go through the slides quite quickly. Just so that you're aware, only 10 to 15% of Mohenjo-daro today has been excavated. But even so, from the patterns that they've actually seen, clearly you could see that there was a very strong grade. There was a lower city, which was also built on a mound. And there was the higher citadel, which is to the west of the city, which has a host of elements which we will look at, including the great baths. It's got the granaries, it's got the school. So there were no big temples, there were no big religious structures, but there was a lot around administration, public use that was within the citadel. And then the rest of the homes were generally within the lower city, set up by major roads and then minor streets. So then looking at infrastructure first, the plan that you see on your extreme right is very, very telling, because as part of the excavation, what they realized is this was an extremely sophisticated infrastructure first approach to city making. So the grid and the streets, the way they were placed, you had proper water supply, you had secondary streets that were drains. Each house had a well of its own, but then clusters of homes also had wells for water supply into individual homes. So there was a fantastic system and a network around the grid that laid it and made it very easy for them to be able to provide water supply to each of the homes. But also in terms of the sewage system, there was a separate drainage system that then collected the water. It came through those secondary channels. It went down the major streets, and then they had those sumps or the soak pits, because regularly they used to be serviced as well at those times. Now, what you see in the image in the middle is one of the major streets, which starts to show you how the drains used to be covered at that time. And one might argue that, oh, they just put stones on top. But they were quite an intelligent people, because they put limestone because it's the lighter of the other stones. And it also avoids some of the smells from the drain, to escape into the streets. So this was a very ingenious way of saying, we will set the drainage system, we will get the water system, water supply system, but we'll work the drainage system in such a way that in certain areas you had open drains that actually ran from top level to bottom level. So there was a gradient given to them, but they were always covered with limestones, and that was to eradicate the smells that came out of this drain. And then there were regular areas where they would actually open them up as kind of soak pits or sumps where they would be servicing these drains regularly. So just imagine at a time, 5,000 years ago, this was a system very much in place and very, very ordered in terms of this is your sewage system, this is your drainage system, and this is how you will supply water to each of the homes. Now, the image that you see to the extreme left also starts to show you that on the outside they had proper foundations, the tiny alleyways, and they had kind of dustbins as well at the entrances. So sanitation was a major element within these cities. So everything was around cleanliness, sanitation, so avoidance of disease. And like I said, they were very much in touch with nature and the reality around them, but they were living in very concentrated, dense urban settlements. And the urban cities start to show you the infrastructure that was laid down to allow for that intensity of urbanness. And now this is a fact. So you can see the three images at the bottom. One begins to show you how the wells were placed, and they were placed in areas where they became social spaces. There were dustbins on the outside of homes. And in Lothal particularly, you could see a combination of baths, toilets, connected to drains. So every household has multi-flush toilets connected to a sewage system, which is a very sophisticated sewage system, as we've seen on the previous slide. And most homes in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had a proper toilet, proper bathroom, a private toilet and bathroom within the home that was connected into these systems. So it was a very complex system. So this is a civil engineering feat for a time when we don't see such elements. I mean, in much later days, I mean, today when you look at some of the spaces in London as well, Joseph Bazalgette is someone who we thank because he actually thought about all of the infrastructure that he laid down. Today we're enjoying the South Bank and we're enjoying the banks of London because of the infrastructure that was laid down. So they were ingenious in that sense, where they thought very carefully about the drainage and the sewage system. So extremely sophisticated in that sense. Now let's look at a bit of the urban planning and the grid. So the first image that we saw, we clearly saw that it was kind of a cardinal element where you've got the two streets, which are the east-west routes and the north-south routes. And clearly you can see the north-south routes and east-west routes are the major elements. So this is where two elephants could pass at the same time. Two bullock carts could operate at the same time. So these were 10-meter wide. And generally, when you see the proportionality of their cities, they worked on not only a grid system, but there were proportions they used to some of their major precincts that they actually created. So when you see the citadel as well, some of the areas that were developed to certain proportions. So there was a proportionality in mind. This was not just a mere rectangle. And even their bricks had particular sizes. There were standardized bricks that were made across all towns, about 6.5 to 7 centimeters in width. And they were used in different patterns to create load-bearing walls and load-bearing construction. But really what you're seeing over here is a 10-meter wide lane, and then you're seeing some of those tiny side lanes where doors and windows kind of open, and there was an opportunity to greet and meet your neighbors. There was an intimacy to the urban grid. So there was order at the bigger level, but then within every square or every big grid block, there was an opportunity to play around in terms of how you put the houses in. So there's an interesting play when you start to see the excavated areas and the patterns that you're seeing in terms of that cobweb architecture of courtyards, bigger spaces, smaller spaces. So the hierarchy, the movement infrastructure is really important to see. So we're zooming into one of the kind of compact quadrants, I would say, of Mohenjo-daro. And what's interesting is you see the major routes are sitting to the north and to your west. But what you start seeing within the cluster is houses are put one next to the other. Some are big, some are small. They all function around courtyards. And then there are big breathing spaces. So, where you've got the drains, where you've got the sewers, you've got those major kind of alleyways that run through, which we looked at in the previous slide. They then run and connect into the main streets. So they are your movement routes for people to get to your homes. There would be entrances, doors, you get to know your neighbors. But then there were social spaces. So where they had the bigger wells, about 600 and odd wells have already been found in Mohenjo-daro. And it is believed that every household had a separate single well of its own where it could depend on fresh water which was drawn from the main well. But these were the bigger social spaces where the communities would actually come together. So the patterns are quite telling in terms of how they thought about hierarchy, how they thought about social spaces, how they thought about interaction, but how they also thought about trade and movement, because they were generally craftsmen, they were generally agriculturalists, and they needed a lot of movement on their main routes, whether you're getting to the citadel, whether you're getting out towards the gate. So there was a sense of hierarchy and an organized way of looking at the wider infrastructure, the wider structure, and then the more fine-grained urban grain within each of the clusters. The image to your right is just beginning to show you how those clusters might have come together to create, wider courtyards, smaller courtyards. These are just artists' impression that are now starting to look at what life might have been from an aerial perspective. And you start to see some of these patterns even when you look at the Google Maps today. And this is no foreign news to us as urban designers. Constantly we've studied, what the grid pattern really means. And if you say some of the earliest cities 5,000 years ago were built on grids, a grid doesn't have to be somewhere where a street actually just meets at a right angle. It's the concept of a grid city where you've got the major boulevards and the streets, and then you've got the clusters of homes or courtyards or alleyways that happen within those. So what you see on top is an impression of Cologne during the Roman period. So during the Roman period, they had particular areas which were distinct public spaces, civic spaces, and then the rest of the city was based on a grid. Manhattan, not far ago, but it's got fractured grids that have actually come together. So time and again we've seen, and some people, like I said, say that grids can be monotonous, but I would argue that a grid gives you the massive big outer structure, and then you have the opportunity to play around with an individual plots. Now look at what Cerda's master plan in Barcelona has done. You've got a formal grid with the chamfers, and then there are different worlds that begin to happen in each of those blocks. And what you see to the right is even in Asia, Japan, this is Sapporo. And if you see the historic town center, again, it's based on two fractured grids. So time and again, we've adapted the grid structure in various ways. It really helps in terms of navigation, order, hierarchy, but also adaptability. You can adapt your plots in many different ways once you've got the formal structure on the outside, which allows for the bigger movement. So let's go a bit into what do we think the homes look like? So having actually looked at what Wheeler excavated in the 1950s with the massive big group, he mainly looked at the citadel. But from the 1920s, they were doing quite a few excavations, and they were trying to understand, this is a load-bearing element, but how were the homes built? And clearly you can see that, although not a class system, there might have been the rich and the commoners, because there were bigger homes with bigger courtyards. There were smaller homes with smaller courtyards, but generally the fabric was around courtyard housing. And what this meant is you would get comfortable space at the bottom. Some of them were 2 stories. Many of them were also triple deck, so they were 3 stories. They generally are considering them to have kind of flat roofs, and kids generally would play within the courtyards, but also any kind of craftsmanship, working with animal husbandry would happen within the courtyards, but also on the decks. They would do things like drying of grain, drying of elements, other household activities would happen on the rooftop. Now, if you're living in India today, you will see how this has actually taken off in very different ways in different parts of India, where you go to the pole houses, for example. I'll show you on the next slide in terms of how this has evolved over time in India, because the courtyard house is something which is very specific to our hot climate, because at times when it was really hot, the central well or the central space not only becomes a social space, but it's also about the microclimate. It really controls the microclimate within a home. When external streets can be very hot, there's no shade. This gives you a bit of that shade, but it also allows the hot air to just rise and leave the home. So courtyards are very well celebrated across India, and you can see them in a contemporary fashion, even built today on many of the typologies that are emerging within India. So this just starts to show how each household was centered within and around those secondary streets. But what might this do in terms of the urban fabric, you might ask? And that's why I bring us to the equation of, if you see the pole houses of Ahmedabad, which is not very far from this region, and it is a historic settlement, widely studied. I've seen a lot of SEP students doing lots of studies and research on the pole houses. What is very interesting is, although there might not be a geometric pattern, the homes are all built around courtyards. A visual up there in the black and white is beginning to show you what the pole house rooftops look like. You can start seeing these are spaces where the families meet. They have gatherings. Some spaces are even used as spiritual spaces, where you might have a tulsi plant that keeps all disease away, and you use that courtyard in a different way. But there are multiple uses to a courtyard, and microclimate being one. I particularly feel they've been innovatively used over time within various typologies in India. So, for example, when you look at the massive big Havelis and the Vadas, also in Goa, when you see the Nalluketu in Kerala, when you see the Chettinad houses of Chennai and Tamil Nadu, you can start to see that has evolved over time. The image below and to your left actually is Artist Village by architect Charles Correa, who very much studied in MIT, and he came back and he says, what is the local typology of my country and how can I work with it? And this is social housing that was created in Belapur. And he worked around that same concept of a courtyard, of how you bring people around a social space. Individually, homes have their own courtyards, but then they open up into a central courtyard. So that concept of courtyard has evolved in so many different ways within India. And I find that really fascinating. So then going to the citadel, as we realized, Mohenjo-daro had two real big areas. One was where all of the commoners and the houses were at the lower city, and the upper city was very much the citadel. Now, what's interesting about the citadel is it has a cluster of amenities and spaces, and there are no major big spaces which are temples or monumental structures that they've left. But this was all about serving society. So I find the citadel quite interesting because they've got the great baths, where it was perhaps a ritualistic area where and that tradition again has passed on in some of the temple precincts of India. When you see, you always have a water body on the outside, and it does perform that feature for ritual. So have these traditions somehow been passed on over time is something that we've got to ask ourselves constantly when we interrogate modern typologies. What have we learned from this time? The other element that they had was the granary, which I find amazing because they had droughts. They had times when they would not be able to collect the grain, and they were so dependent on the nature around them that they had this massive granary that was built. And I think the granary of Harappa is even better documented than the one in Mohenjo-daro. So Wheeler has done a lot of work on the granary in Mohenjo-daro. He's excavated it with a group of people the excavation went on for almost kind of 10, 15 years. He worked until 1952 and he's documented this. But Harappa, there are better traces of how the granaries, and every city had this major big granary at the top. Now, this is all about society, administration. So, when there was a famine, when there was scarcity of food, they would store food at 4 levels. And it's very interesting to see the architectural facets of the granary in terms of how that's developed. They had a college up there, which has a lot of rooms in terms of learning. But as you see, every block has a ratio and a proportion to it. They didn't just build rectangular buildings one after the other. There was some sense of how they stitched these elements together, but how they thought about the proportions of everything coming together. At the base, where the fortifications note is, where you start seeing the big gate to the citadel, they also had an administrative center where they had a hall, and traces of the hall can be seen. You'll see images further down. And the stupa that you see is actually a structure from the 80s. So Buddhism also did have an influence on Mohenjo-daro, Mound of the Dead, but that was AD. This is all BC that we're talking about, and I'll touch a bit on that element as well. So looking at the baths, like I said, the Great Baths was an area for ritualistic purposes, 52 meters by 32 meters in size. It had rooms around it. It was 2.4 meters deep. And here again, the expertise in terms of, making sure that the water doesn't just drain out. There was an inlet which brought water in. There was a level change, and slowly there was a hole at the other end which was taking you straight into the drains. And there was bitumen, so there was a lining of burnt brick and bitumen. So they were very good in terms of waterproofing as well in those days. A massive big amenity for the local population over here, and this is believed to be something that was open to everybody. And this is the area that has been maximally excavated to a detail where lots of people have done architectural drawings of what they felt happened around it in terms of the rooms, how people gathered around it. There are scenes that have been depicted by artists to show what might have happened. There's also a movie that was made in terms of Mohenjo-daro in India, which actually starts to show you scenes around the baths in terms of how they might have used it. What you see in the far distance is the Buddhist stupa, which we will touch on further down. So going to the granary, I found this really fascinating. So the granary is the most complicated structure in my opinion, because it's got these rows and rows of areas where additional layers have been built up. And the image that you see in the center is where Wheeler was very keen to start to show the public how the grain might have been dropped into the different levels. So there were these pits and there were these major walls. The holes that you see within the walls was where the wooden beams were. So it had a base structure, which was of brick, but then it had a superstructure of wood, which held all of the grain in the different compartments. And you can start seeing geographically, it is placed very close to the baths. And a lot of it has been destroyed. And the extreme image that you see is actually one person is walking through the drain. So that drain actually leads out of the baths. And you can see the proximity of the bath to the granary. So there was a strong dialogue between what was happening in the granary, the public life within the baths, the college. So all of this was pretty tied up within the citadel at the north. And the bricks that you see, these were brick steps that were built to get to the different levels, because it was built in 3 tiers and 3 layers. And it was very ingeniously designed, where you had these kind of pits where you'd actually drop the grain, they would then get collected, they would go into the different levels. And then you had these stairs in the middle that would actually take you to the upper looms where the grain used to be stored. And this is the pillared hall further down. And this is the administrative hall, meant to be a place where perhaps administrative decisions took place. Like I said, there is no ruling class found in Mohenjo-daro, but there are lots of seals that do tell you that there was a centralized system and there was an administrative system in place. So perhaps this was a meeting hall where they would meet. And the ruins that you see at the base, only 2 of the rows have survived. And this is one of the areas where, I was reading in terms of the excavation, is not as well maintained as what you see upper citadel, which is the baths, the granary, and also the stupa, which is a later time. So archaeologists and historians have tried to piece what that hall might have looked like. Totally brick structures with kind of stone foundations. And again, a wooden superstructure would hold the roof in this area. And again, quite ingenious, simple little hall, but clear proportions and clear ratios were used in terms of creating these spaces within the citadel. Now, this is quite interesting. And for the longest time, the Buddhist stupa was less understood. But as recent as, I think, May of last year, where Pakistan is still doing a bit of local excavation where they can through the funding that they're getting, they found this pendant of Lord Buddha. So Buddhism had evolved in the BC, but in the later stages, it is believed that the Mahayana Buddhism actually traveled to this part, which is a widely known form of Buddhism where Buddha really sits on a lotus leaf and he's in a tranquil position, kind of uh, sending you his blessings, or he's in a prayer position. So there's a stupa found right in the middle, which is a clay mound sitting on burnt bricks. And there are lots of rooms on the outside. And the locals still call it an area where the monks would just go and pray to Lord Buddha. So this was in AD. So this is something that is a later addition to Mohenjo-daro. What they realized during the excavations, though, is even the citadel is at the highest point. Everything in the rooms and the mounds in itself are about 65 feet above the riverbed. So there are layers and layers of old historic city layers that are built under this. So you can see they had lots of floods, and over time, the pattern was once a grid is destroyed, you build over that grid. So this is how their cities had actually survived for time. But with the great floods, it is understood that many people had to leave because it was one of the major tectonic events that did take place, which did wipe out everything. So let's zoom in into a bit of the economy of the local people. So, like I said, having read a lot of what they did, there was a strong relationship with agriculture, the nature, and the hinterland. They did a lot of intercropping, which was amazing at a time when, you don't talk about seasonal crop growing. They were doing that at the time. They would have a particular crop growing in summers, they would have a particular another crop growing in winters. They had really worked their way in terms of how you irrigate the land, because they were in this very rich floodplain and flood valley of the Indus River or the Saraswati River. They did a lot of animal husbandry, and you can see on their seals, they've got animals from rhinoceros, buffaloes, also camels, always in profile, never the front of the animal, always in profile with some stories written around them. But to date, nobody has been able to uncover what that language was. So they did have the seals as administration. They did a lot of mining. So locally as well in Rajasthan area today, you do get a lot of the mining. So they had discovered gold, they had discovered silver, they had discovered quite a few. So they did a lot of jewelry, lots of beads. Lots of jewelry was being made over here and also sent to Mesopotamia and Egypt at the time. Cotton was one of their major, if anybody mastered the act of collecting cotton and making cloth out of it, cotton trade, this is actually known as the cotton route at a time. So they were ingenious in that sense, where they had actually discovered how to start making cloth, but also how do you dye that cloth? Because when you see the priest king and when you see his the cloth that is sat around him, you can clearly see it's got embossed with some flower prints. So you could see they were already doing that level of detail on cotton work at the time. So dyeing was far advanced at that time. And there are areas which they found, which initially people thought were restaurants, because they have got these huge kilns or these huge pots. And then they actually realized these were areas where they used to dye cloth, because it was a major industry. Cotton was one of their biggest trades that actually happened. And arts and crafts. So you'll see the different kinds of arts and crafts, from the toys to the pottery, to some of the beautiful statues that have been carved at that time, ahead of the times, I would say. And even Wheeler has actually argued that. So ports, why I say trade was very important. So all of this rich region and everything that was being created at the time, they needed the ports. So Mohenjo-daro is not close to a port, but where Lothal is, for example, the image to your right, upper right, is artist visualization of what Lothal might have been at the time. It's now in present day Gujarat. And what you see
क्या
down
सुन रहे
there,
हैं? मैं लेक्चर दे दिए.
sorry. Yes, what you see at the image down there is an actual image of what Lothal looks like at the moment. And it's fighting for UNESCO status, because what they've realized is these ports, the maritime industry was far advanced. They were making their boats. And also at the time, it was understood that the Persian Gulf was not as deep as it is today. Due to climate change, the Persian Gulf has now gotten deeper. It was easier for them to get to Mesopotamia. The journey was not so arduous, was not so long, where present day Dubai and adjoining areas is where land had actually started to hit the Persian Gulf. So it was easier for them to have these smaller boats and do trading with Mesopotamia and Egypt at the time. Now, looking at the standardization, this is really fascinating. And there's a whole book. The image in the middle is at British Museum. They've actually kept some of the weights that these guys used to use. Because remember, it was barter system at that time. There wasn't any exchange of money. There was mainly, everything was based on, you would weigh something and then you would exchange goods at the time. So you would land up exchanging goods between different communities. You would exchange goods with foreign communities at the time. So these weights were a measure for them to know, I'm giving you a particular product of a particular weight. And throughout the region, whether you see Harappa, whether you see Lothal, they have found traces of weights of the same size. So much like the Greek area where they had stones of a particular size, this was again a standardized system across the Indus Valley. And the seals are extremely interesting because a lot of them have been found in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, also in different parts of Indus Valley. And actually, one of the earliest seals was found in Harappa by the British in 1856. But not a lot was made out of it. They knew that this was an archaeological finding. And I think Banerjee further down discovered Mohenjo-daro, and he said, "Listen, we've got to get our act together." And he wrote to this British general, and he said, "You found this seal. Let's connect the dots." So a lot of these seals have found, but to date, nobody has been able to uncover what they meant. The one thing they do realize is because they were embossed into metal and they were found on smaller rags, smaller metal casts, what they feel is this was an administrative way of saying this has come from Indus Valley. This is a product from Indus Valley. This is our seal. And there was a system in place. Now, to the extreme left, where you see a seal which is completely broken off, this is the only seal where you see a human figure sitting in a yogic pose, I would say. And yogic pose meaning, he also has three heads, and he also has a particular element. It's called the Pashupati. And the Pashupati seal actually says that they were followers of Lord Shiva. So they used to follow Lord Shiva. A lot of the archaeologists have said this is definitely Shiva. At that time, bear in mind, Hinduism was not discovered. It was a Vedic system. So clearly they had some following for Lord Shiva, but also Mother Goddess. And that has again continued through the traditions. But yeah, Shiva clearly is a known god and very much revered in different parts of India. So the language is again quite interesting. 600 plus symbols have been found, but again, nobody's been able to uncover what they meant in terms of language. It was understood that the first sentence was written right to left. And then after that, they would start writing left to right. Some people argue that everything was written left to right. So there are two different theories that are going on around in terms of how they wrote. I wish there was someone, just like we've deciphered other ancient languages, who could decipher this language, and then we could understand what they were trying to say. But many of their symbols are around tools, around flowers, around weights, around nature. So there are ways where they're kind of, trying to emulate or say something, but through these symbols, if we could figure out what the language was, we could have uncovered a lot more about Indus Valley. Arts and crafts, really, really interesting. Like I said, they were very fond of their jewelry, and some of the jewelry that you see in the middle image over here. To date, I have seen some traditional Indian jewelry where, you call a kudi, for example, which is something made out of diamonds, and it's got a similar style. So some of those traditions, some of those arts and crafts elements, because these people were craftsmen, have actually followed through, and they're in the region around the Indus Valley still. You see some of this artwork happening, like when you see in the Thar Desert, you see what's happening in Gujarat, you see some of the pottery that's coming out. There are remnants of it you start to see, but it's also kind of evolved over time. So they worked a lot with wood, they worked a lot with metal. What you see up there are some of the stone foundations that were actually seen, or it's maybe a replica of what they saw as stone foundations to some of the brick columns or walls that were set up in the citadel in Harappa and also in Mohenjo-daro. So this is just a conglomeration of images that actually show how they worked with metal at different scales, from construction to the arts and crafts. But jewelry was a major element. And women generally, when you see them depicted, they wear a lot of jewelry around the necks, but also around their hands. And there was a sense of different elements of jewelry, and terracotta as well. You can see lots of good pottery work that actually did come out from that time. Agriculture for me is very interesting. So when you start seeing how they worked with the natural surrounds around them. Now, bear in mind, all of these cities were around very mature riverbed and a very fertile riverbed. So apart from barley, wheat, all of these things that were growing widely in other parts of Mesopotamia as well, they also had things like mustard. So where you say sarso ka tel, for example, mustard was grown quite widely. They also had other crops which are not primary crops that were grown at the time, and they made oil out of it. So even sesame, for example. Now, cotton trading is very interesting because cotton is a very water hungry crop. And how you develop it in a very sustainable way now is going to be very interesting, because this whole region, even to date, does do a lot of cotton farming. It does produce a lot of the khadi and the cotton. And there's a lot of that cotton that does get exported. There's a lot of the cotton that is still being dyed in the old methodologies. So, using a lot of water. It's a very water intensive trade and arts and crafts element. So how you work with cotton, there are different companies now intervening in this part of India and also perhaps Pakistan to look at how you might be able to do more sustainable cotton farming. Because, are you just doing rain fed elements in terms of how you grow the cotton? Is it drip fed? So there are companies that are looking at how we might be able to create sustainable farming out of this. The images that you see to your right are to date in Pakistan and also in Afghanistan, some of the original irrigatory methods where you actually reroute water in a particular way to a field. These are the most nascent ways of how you can actually get water into agricultural fields, are still being practiced. There are methods to kind of make them more technical and, engineered ways of doing it to reroute water. Because remember, this area is, when it floods, it really floods. And it's a very rich floodplain, but they also do have lots of droughts and famines. So how do you work with the land? And there are lots of funding mechanisms now that are in place to look at how you can modernize this method of farming in this area, because some of the farmers and the poorer communities still depend on this basic element of farming in this area. Meenakshi, how am I doing for time? Because if I'm running way over time, I'll rush through these very, very quickly.
We have just 7 minutes left, and I believe you have a couple of slides, like 3 or 4, right?
Yeah, I'll wrap up
And we'll
very,
take
very
one
quickly.
question we have from the audience, and probably I think that would how we'll wrap up the conversation. Okay.
Sure. Thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you so much. So like I said, cotton and silk, what you see on top again is something in the British Museum where they've actually found traces of how tussar silk was actually made. And they've actually kept it as a specimen of what was being produced at the time. Blue dyes, indigo dyes, the dyeing methods that we've actually talking about are still happening to date. And that's why, some kind of mechanisms are coming into place to use waterless dyeing in this area. But these industries should not die. They should be kept alive. So if there are ways of working intelligently with water harvesting and to see that these old dyeing techniques do not just go away, but are nurtured and are kept as old traditional methodologies, that would be brilliant. But it is something about sustainability, because this is an area where water is quite scarce. And arts and crafts, when Wheeler saw the Dancing Girl, which was produced during the Mohenjo-daro era, he says way ahead of her times. Look at the poise, look at the confidence. Would you get a pose like this? They were fascinated when they saw this being produced. So in terms of arts and crafts, they were way ahead in terms of how their art was very progress. The craftsmanship was very progress. What you see further down south in black and white is the Mother Goddess. And I was actually looking at, the similarities. And when you see the Bishnoi community in Thar Desert, it's quite interesting to see how some of those, wearing a lot of jewelry, having a lot of those ivory bangles, that has still continued to date. And the Thar people actually do dress up with lots of jewelry. The general Thar population, the images that you see to your right, is what some of these traditions have actually, how they've evolved and they've continued through the different tribal communities within India and also perhaps Pakistan. And this is what it actually shows you. The Bishnoi community is closest to how you would see some of the women dressed up in those times, because they were depicted in their statues, in their artwork. And again, you've got the priest king and the sitting male figure, which shows you, the dhoti is a very popularly used garment in India. And you would see it is used in traditional functions. It is used for celebratory functions. It is used as the common man in some of the regional parts of India still, but it has evolved over time. And you can see that they were wearing garments such as the dhoti even at that time with a drape around them. And that has actually evolved again as a dress in India over time. So some of the lessons learned, and I'm happy to pause here to say, as part of the question and answer, some of the things that we've looked at is that infrastructure first approach really fascinates me at a time when you could have just had ad hoc development. But no, they had a set system, a set method. They were civil engineers by power, but also city planners. And they got that absolutely, they nailed it absolutely right when it comes to their sewage and their drainage system. The compact city concept, where you've got a clear relationship with nature, but you creating these urban centers which are all about human activity, concentrated urban development, and that follows the compact pattern of living around these courtyards and tight streets. The grid city concept, which we have looked at. I think working with nature is great. Climate action, which is going to be required. And when you depend so much on nature, when nature is intrinsic to your every ability to work, to produce stuff, to trade, how do you create resilience in a system where you're depending so much on your hinterland? And I think this is something perhaps, they might have not thought of. They were totally dependent on their nature. And one big tectonic event, sadly, has wiped that whole area out. So climate action in terms of how we work with nature and how we work to solidify our base within nature, but working constructively and sustainably is going to be very important. For me, the element of circularity was absolutely evident in how they functioned, because they clearly had a good interrelationship. They worked with the crops. They worked at a time when there would be a famine or they would have scarcity of food. But circularity was very, very big in the system, where they reused, recycled, really worked with the materials that they had locally and made the best use of what they had in terms of local materials and techniques and age-old traditions and techniques. That's just brilliant to see that in India to date. I can start seeing some of those traditions that have still been passed on. And I'll end it there. I'm really sorry I might have overrun time. Sorry.
That's okay. We enjoyed, listening to the presentation, how you connected and put, all the insight, how it was connected from the past even today, right? And rather, I will give this opportunity to have people who have raised hands. Shweta?
Yeah, I'm here. As the question in the chat box also, I just wanted to ask, like you have mentioned Saraswati River, but in the presentation there was no mention of Sindhu River being the basic Indus river that is the civilization built around. So, are there no records of the river being the Sindhu River in
No, I
original?
would say,
Yeah.
Shweta, there are lots of tributaries in that area. Why I mentioned Saraswati is the Saraswat Brahmins actually claim that they're from there. There is the Sindhu as well. The
Yeah.
Indus Valley has a rich network of lots of river tributaries. But I think
Correct.
one of the biggest issues was that the Saraswati River, from what I've read, and don't quote me on this, I'm not a historian. I've been reading a lot of background research documents. So this is good. It's a discussion. I do believe that, yes, there was the Sindhu River as well. But the Saraswati River particularly changed course. So some of the major cities that were around that area were deeply impacted when rivers changed course. And I wouldn't just focus on Saraswati. There were major tributaries through that area. And I think when the famine hit, one of the beliefs is also that when the tectonic events actually happened and massive big floods came in, the dynamic of the soil completely changed, because the soil started getting a lot of salt and they couldn't grow the agricultural produce that they were growing originally. So there are loads of historical events that record different things. But I'm not arguing that there was no Sindhu River. There is a Sindhu River, definitely.
Okay, but you didn't come across any legit published source or any information that talked about it?
I think on Wikipedia, there are a lot of the rivers that are being referred to within the Indus Valley. So it was a
Okay.
rich network of them. And I'm sure that when you read through some of the archaeological findings,
Yeah.
there's a lot of in-depth material that you'll find in terms of names of the different rivers.
Yeah. And similarly, but the related question was that when you talked about different community and the social cultural aspects that helped form the physical structure there and the infrastructure. So you haven't mentioned the Sindhi community and the cultural practices they had. So is there none of the records or published sources speak about it? Is that the case?
I think there are, and I have not focused on particular communities. I've focused
Mhm.
more around the trade that happened.
Yeah, yeah, I
I've
understand.
focused more around what they did at the time in terms of a people, because I'm trying to focus more on the city planning aspect of it. I'm trying to focus more on the sustainability aspect of it. And I wouldn't argue I think there are subsects and subsects of so many communities that have risen from the Indus Valley. I think most of India today can actually proudly say that they've got some ancestral connection from the Indus Valley because it was one of the most predominant existing communities at that time. And as you know, when the decline started to happen, people traveled to different parts. Some
Yeah.
people in Calcutta actually proclaim that they have a connection to the Indus Valley because some of the mythological stories that were told by their grandparents and their mums are akin to what were being shown on some of the seals in Mohenjo-daro. So I wouldn't argue that any community has been left out. I would just say I have looked at it only from a city planning, urban design perspective. Religion, community, culture, these are such in-depth topics. If I go into that, I would just do one presentation just on the communities of the Indus Valley.
Okay, makes sense. And the maps that you showed, so are there any
Shweta,
just the last
considering
one?
the time constraint, we would like to wrap this, and we have one question we wanted to check with Sai. Before we checking with Sai, I just wanted to mention that we will be finishing it at 6:40 India time, which is 7 minutes left. And before we move on to Sai, I just wanted to ask you, Vinita, what, in your perspective, were the lessons from Indus Valley Civilization? We should be implying those in our city planning framework, I would say.
Yeah.
What is your favorite research piece that you wanted that to see from the past, bringing it today?
Yes. I think the thing that struck me the most is the interrelationship they had with nature. So they built their cities around a system. So I'm looking at it from a regional perspective. And for me, what was really fascinating is historically, every city, every town has always been close to riverbeds. But that interrelationship that they developed with the agricultural surroundings and how they tamed the agricultural land through smart irrigation systems, smart rainwater harvesting, even at that time, and the notion of circularity, which we really need today. Every element of material really matters. Today we've got so many historic buildings that we are retrofitting, we're working with. I think these were a people who time and again built on top of the grid that they had already established. So that principle of circularity and also working with your hinterland. During globalization, a lot of our stuff comes from different regions. Why are we not working with local materials more? Why do we not understand local climatic conditions more and work with that? In Dubai, when you see all of these glass towers, for example, that are happening, have we understood climate really well? Or, are we adapting our architecture? So there are so many lessons to be learned at different layers and different levels from a region to city planning all the way down to the scale of the home.
Agreed to definitely agree. And it's also that the moment we haven't even explored our local materials, and we've moved from our local materials to the wider, in the West, or I would say different ways to explore materials for the building. Hence, we are caught up in global climate change environment, right? So definitely there's a lot more to explore within our industry, that we stay local, explore that in a way that we exhausted those content, and then we moved ahead.
Yes, yes.
Sai, would you like to come up?
Yeah, yes, of course. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Vinita, for that enlightening session on Mohenjo-daro and its intricate details. I would like to ask only one question crisply. Sorry, I don't want to take much time. My doubt is you have talked about the trade route. You also said that was called as cotton route, if at all we want to name it after, so on and so forth. What is happening to the trade within the region, within the country? Because we have also learned that Dwaraka and Hastinapur, they were also like similar cities. They were also
Yes.
flourished during that time.
Yeah.
Okay, so what
Yeah.
happened? Did we have any archaeological findings that they had extensive trade with the regional things? And also,
Yes.
coming to the shipbuilding, yeah, one more supplementary question. We have learned that in Rigveda, one of the mandalas speak about the shipbuilding in the craft of shipbuilding and how the people used to navigate and orient their ships, etc. So it was a vastly developed knowledge system there. So what happened to the naval trade with the other parts of the regions, except other than the Egypt and Mesopotamia? That's my doubt.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, because they had parts and they had developed trade routes also with other parts of Asia. So there was a strong link overland even to other parts of Asia. I've just not read a lot in terms of, because I was comparing it to the contemporaneous times of Mesopotamia and Egypt, because so much has been written about those two, whereas a lot has not been written about Indus Valley from that very same period. So I was trying to compare those trade routes, but absolutely right, Sai. When I read that there were other parts of Asia. So, for example, that's why also Buddhism eventually did land up coming to this part, because there were routes already
Yes.
established. Buddhism did
Right.
travel to this area because it was already evident in southern China. It was already evident in the northeast. And there were traces of Buddhism in later years. So, although Buddhism is BC, traces of what we find in Mohenjo-daro, particularly, is AD, so where they discovered it. But you're absolutely spot on. It was not just the West that they were dealing with. And between the
Yes.
cities in itself, what I realized is there was a strong infrastructure between some of the major cities. So they would depend on bullock carts, on elephants, on camels, within the Rajasthan area, for example. So in different areas, the animal husbandry was really, really developed. And, whether they would groom them at home as, you'd have dogs and cats and fowl, but you also have the bigger animals, which were used to carry some of the products developed in certain areas to other cities. And the bigger cities, the urban centers like Harappa, Lothal, Rakhigarhi, I was reading about it as
Dholavi, Dharavi, yes.
they being the major centers of production, because that's where all of the artifacts, so most of the artifacts were actually found in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, when they went into people's homes, because these were the people who were the craftsmen. And then that used to get collected, taken to marketplaces, if you see what I mean. So there was a lot of trade between the major centers, and there were more than 1,000 settlements. So you can imagine there were the major urban centers, but there were also the smaller centers.
Right.
Thank you.
And
Thank you,
I would
Vinita.
like
Thank you,
to,
Sai. For
okay.
considering the time, Sai, we would like to conclude here because we are 10 minutes overboard. And definitely, if you have more questions, please feel free to drop in the chat box. We will be covering more conversations even on ancient cities and even more on cities, right? So please feel free to drop your questions or any suggestions you have it. So we would like to conclude here. Thank you, Vinita, so much. I mean, there were lot to pick on in the presentation, lot to discuss. But however, we'll try to cover some other day. But thank you so much for your insight into that. It really vicariously take us to the ancient city, that how the life was lived, and definitely there are lessons, and then leaving us to rethink that there are some actions we really need to reconsider in doing our overall lifestyle or spending time in the cities, reconsidering our actions, everything, right? Thank you very much, everybody.
And thank you,
We will
UDG and IUDI, for having me. Thank you, Meenakshi. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining
Bye,
us.
everyone.